This is the first of two videos on genes and alleles. In this video, I want to introduce you to some of the important vocabulary words and talk about simple, or what's known as complete dominance. Before we get in the details of this video, I want to just do a little bit of review. Remember that DNA is your genetic code, and it is organized into smaller pieces called chromosomes that are found in the nucleus of the cell. The order of the DNA nucleotide bases, which we use the letters A, T, C, and G to identify them in a shortened form, this arrangement of bases provides particular directions for a particular protein. And those directions are actually what the gene is. It's the directions for a particular protein. RNA then transcribes the DNA gene, copies it, and then translates it into the correct protein out in the cytoplasm of the cell at the ribosome. This was all covered previously in our videos on protein synthesis and transcription and translation. So now let's look at genes and alleles. Well, you know that sexual reproduction creates offspring that has chromosomes that are inherited from both parents because two parents are needed for sexual reproduction. Therefore, chromosomes can be organized into what's known as homologous pairs, one from each parent. And each copy in a pair will have genes that code for the same kinds of proteins that produce the same kinds of trait, such as eye color or hair color. Now, the genes on each separate chromosome could be exactly the same, or they could be slightly different. And when they are slightly different genes for the same trait, they are known as alleles. There are certain words we use to talk about the relationship between these two alleles that are found in your homologous chromosomes. Homozygous is the word we use to talk about when there are two copies of the same allele are present. So if we talk about something like eye color, there'd be two copies of a gene for brown eyes. Whereas heterozygous is the word that talks about the two copies of the genes are slightly different. Maybe there was one for a brown eye and one for a blue eye. The alleles in the genes are known as the genotype. But the way the trait shows up in the organism is the phenotype. And we can only see the phenotype. We can deduce the genotype, but we only see the phenotype. And when we're talking about alleles, we indicate them by letters, usually capital and lowercase. So on illustration here, our genotype is given up top. So we see, two capital S's for the alleles here that produce the straight wings on the phenotype for this fruit fly, whereas two copies of the W allele is going to give you wrinkled wings down on the phenotype layer. Now, alleles interact with each other because you have two of them, and so they're going to potentially affect each other. There is simple dominance, where one allele can dominate the other and actually hide that second allele. There is incomplete dominance, where the traits determined by these two alleles actually blend together to make something new. There is codominance, where these two traits, these two phenotypes, are both present in the organism. And then there are multiple alleles, where the final expression of the trait in the phenotype depends on more than two alleles, and how all the different alleles work together determine what you see in the phenotype. So I'm going to just focus on simple dominance in this video. We'll talk about the other types of interactions between alleles in the second video. In simple dominance, you just have two alleles. One is dominant, and we write that or indicate it with capital letters. And one is recessive, and it gets a lowercase letter. The dominant phenotype is expressed as long as there is one copy of that dominant allele present. And so the genotype can be homozygous, dominant alleles, or even heterozygous, one of each, but the phenotype will always be that dominant trait, whatever that is associated with that allele. In contrast, the recessive phenotype is only expressed if both recessive alleles are present. So you only see the recessive phenotype when you have a homozygous recessive genotype in simple dominance. And of course, the phenotype is that recessive form. So to just look at an example, and this is a Punnett square, which we're going to have a separate video talking about how you use these, and it helps you determine what potential offspring genotypes are. But in pea plants, the tall allele, which we're going to use a capital T to indicate it, is dominant to the short or the dwarf allele, which is a lowercase t. So if there are two heterozygous parents, so these are our parents, so one parent provides an allele with a capital T, one with a small t. The other parent also is heterozygous, so it gives a capital T and a small t. And then you fill out the Punnett square and discover that potentially you can have offspring that are homozygous tall. They've inherited two capital T's. Heterozygous and tall in the phenotype, having inherited one capital T, which then dominates over this lowercase t. Or homozygous short or dwarf, because they've inherited both copies of the recessive allele. All of this was figured out by an Austrian monk by the name of Gregor Mendel, who studied the inheritance of traits in the garden using pea plants. He started off working with mice in the first place, but then his supervisor didn't like the idea of working with animals and so had him work with plants. So Mendel's investigations discovered this relationship of simple dominance, and it's known as Mendelian genetics now. And from his work, he also developed 3 laws of inheritance. But really, his work was put aside and forgotten and wasn't discovered as an important contribution to science until the beginning of the 20th century. So even though he was working in the 19th century, he didn't impact the scientists that were of his age. We now know that allele interaction is more complicated than simple dominance, but he started with peas, and there are several traits in peas that are in this simple dominance relationship. So the traits he was looking at were looking at the seed. Was it a round, smooth seed or a wrinkled seed? What color was the seed, yellow or green? What did the pods look like? And these are just ordinary garden peas that you might eat for supper. The colors of the pod, the colors of the flower on the pea plant, where the flower is positioned. Is it along the stem in an axial position, or is it at the end in a terminal position? And then, of course, how tall they are. Are they a tall pea plant or a short dwarf pea plant? And so tracking these 7 traits, he was able to make some discoveries about how alleles interacted with each other, because all of these are ones that have a simple dominance relationship. The 3 laws of inheritance that Mendel proposed then based on his research. First, we have the law of segregation that says every individual organism has 2 alleles for each trait, and these alleles segregate or they separate during meiosis when gametes are formed, so that each gamete only has one of those potential 2 alleles to go on to the next generation. The second law is called the law of independent assortment, and that says that alleles for separate traits are passed independently of one another, so they aren't connected one to another. And finally, the law of inheritance states that in heterozygous inheritance, one allele will be dominant. In reality, though, very few traits show simple dominance. The more complicated ones that we'll talk about in the next video are much more common. So in summary, we know that genes on DNA will code for proteins, which then produce certain characteristics we call traits in organisms. That genes can come with different variations for that particular trait, which we call alleles. That the offspring produced by sexual reproduction inherit 2 alleles of most genes. The exception are some sex chromosome genes that we will talk about later. And what they inherit is known as the genotype. The alleles of the genes that are present in an organism produce a trait that can be observed, and this is the phenotype, and that alleles can interact in this simple dominance relationship, though they don't have to. Life is more complicated than just simple dominance, but for the purposes of this video, that's as much as we're going to talk about today.